All right. So, the big R. I need to talk, first of all, Justin, I have to ask you about...
Bring it on.
We haven't had many guests who have been here who have been directly affected by the FTX, right? The FTX, as I call it now.
Yep. I would say the big scarlet F. Anyway, we were a lead investor to FTX. We invested $278 million, which is a lot of money in absolute terms, but is a very, very small percentage of our portfolio.
Yeah.
Thankfully, we had no exposure to the FTT token. We kept no funds on FTX. For us, this is a learning experience in every sense of the word. I could go on, but I'll be honest. My boss, co-founder Matt Wong of Paradigm, did an excellent, much more eloquent tweet thread about what we're learning as a firm after this. And I would all encourage you to look to that. For us, we look at this as why, more than ever, we think we do need regulation.
Right.
That part of what happened here is that once again, something is blown up offshore, but the risk comes back to Americans and American investors. That's why you want to find a way to let this industry grow here in the States. Mm-hmm. And now perhaps opens us up to the major conversation we can talk about.
Yeah, for sure. But also just kudos for coming, because we had a lot of people drop who were affected and didn't want to come here and didn't want to talk about it, right?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? We did a big event yesterday in DC, not to cross-advertise. We called it Hands on Web3. We brought 10 of our portfolio companies, Coinbase, Uniswap, Royal. We also invited Circle and Stellar and Filecoin, which weren't even in our portfolio, MoonPay as well, and an artist, an NFT artist called Creature World. And we had scheduled this for months beforehand. And the week that FTX blew up, I polled our portfolio and I said, do you guys still want to do this? And I thought the answer was yes, but they said, more than ever. We believe in this tech. If we were to reschedule, that suggests we actually don't agree that this is really important. This is the best time to educate people.
Right.
And we got over 100 people from government to come and see this. And I'll never forget that one skeptic looking at, not to play favorites, Royal, seeing how it works said, I get it now. So I'm trying to use the old JFK quote that like the Chinese character for crisis is one removed from opportunity.
Right.
This is probably the best time now to educate people about crypto and say how much bigger it is than just any one company or even just token trading. Mm-hmm. And I'm hopeful we're going to do a lot more of these as an industry and at Paradigm.
But so education has been like a watchword of the day. A lot of people have been talking about it and expressing similar thoughts about that this is now an opportune time because there's conversation and then you can have education, right? But then on the flip side, you have SBF says, fuck regulators, and says...
I took that personally. I was a regulator.
He meant you. No. And he says they're all bad people and they're all doing bad things. And like, I think hours later, because that was a private conversation that was reported out, right? There's no expectation of privacy. He's talking to a reporter. But on the other side, he had his public statements, which were like, I'm encouraged, whatever. They were obviously the fluff that he's been selling. So, but what impact is that? When you're talking about education, you first have to climb out of this deep pit of like, now everyone is going to paint with that brush, right? Someone who is double talking and saying just the most vile things you possibly can about people who you're hoping will partner with you in industry. Right?
This really goes to the point of it, though, right? Which is for us, if I were to go as Justin Slaughter and say, trust me, bro, this is really good, it would be that problem. That's why for us, we always focus on the tech. I try to get people to say, okay, you've got reasonable concern. And, what no one has done yet is send here, here is a laptop with Uniswap on it. Have you ever seen it before? We did this for a regulator earlier in the year who's coming to our office. And he's wanted for a chat. And I was like, actually, let's do a demo of Uniswap and MetaMask. And I think I want to do OpenSea as well. And someone said on the team, well, Justin, he's seen this before. And I was like, no, I don't think so. And the reason is very simple. First off, there's been a pandemic. Usually when you work in the government, I was at CFTC in the Obama years, and I was at SEC at the start of the Biden admin, you normally would do visits to companies or if companies come in. But first off, you can't do visits to companies during a pandemic's teeth. It just doesn't happen. Second, you can't do demos on government computers usually because they're firewalls.
Right.
No one in government can experiment with, most things. When I was in government, this is a great example. You can't, as a government employee, have Twitter or Facebook or anything other than LinkedIn on your computer. You can't on your government phone even. which is not a big deal for things that are ubiquitous in your life during the nighttime. But for finance, it's very hard to understand how crypto works unless you experiment with it. And this is why, right, the Office of Government Ethics a few months ago saying no one may own crypto and work on crypto policy is a problem.
Right.
Because if you don't understand how this works, you're going to struggle to regulate it well.
Yeah. So, Catherine, you have mentioned on our preparatory calls that you have had lots of conversations with regulators and have worked with them. Does that do you empathize with that, with what Justin's talking about? And also, how has this changed in the past week? Have you noticed a relationship shift? Right.
So, I want to pull on a couple threads that Justin mentioned. I too have spent time in the government. I was a prosecutor for 10 years and feel like I've seen a number of the Sam, now I call him Sam Bankrupt-Fried, but a number of those types of personalities.
Yeah.
And the thread I want to pull on, though, is the regulatory thread, which is why we're here. And the fact of the matter is, had more time been spent when it should have by regulators in the kind of earlier days, and I know we're still in the scheme of things in early days, had regulation been started then, had the education started at that point when it should have, we would not be where we are today. We're here today because we have offshore activity, and more activity is being pushed offshore. So many folks in the regulatory world at that time, and we talked about this before, were hoping that this would all go away and ignored it. If you ignore it, we don't give it the bona fides. If we regulate it, that means we're
legitimizing it.
Legitimizing it, exactly. Right. Putting the stamp of authenticity on it. We're past that point. It's not going away. And it's certainly not going away even with these recent events. And these recent events will continue to unfold. I don't know if anybody saw the declaration today by the new CEO. It's an eye-opener. It's definitely worth a good read. And you can see kind of the shell game that was going on. And a lot of that shell game is because you have so much of the activity that's offshore. And when I was a prosecutor, when we had offshore activity, it is so much harder to look at. It's so much harder to get people back. I mean, we'll see extradition at some point, or we'll see him make a run for it. He's the type of personality you might see a run for it. I think we all saw the Argentina Twitter thread this weekend. But the important part is that sometimes the best change is in moments of punctuated equilibrium, and I believe we're in that moment right now. It's a science term, but it's equally applicable here for regulation. We have needed regulation, but we need the right regulation. We need that, I've called it the Goldilocks regulation. If you do too much, you continue to push activity offshores, where it's more dangerous for us on many levels, from a national security standpoint to a getting criminals back standpoint. But if we get the right education, the right regulation, but they have to understand how the businesses work and operate, which is where you guys come in, and your activity yesterday is a really important part of that. But we've spent a lot of time talking to members of Congress. There's some interesting bedfellows we've also talked about in Congress on both sides of the aisle. But there's a lot of activity going on right now, and I think it's a slow process, but it's one of the best places that we can look to get more clarity and the right framework for crypto on the go forward to try to avoid your scammers and your FTXs.
Right. But so I'm curious about that this doesn't go away, and you say especially now. But to me, I'm tempted to feel, especially if I'm putting myself in the position of someone who is sort of crypto reticent or whatever. I'm like, this is better than ever in terms of it going away. It seems closer than ever to me just having to go, if I now ignore it for maybe, I don't know, 2 more months, another couple dominoes are going to fall, and then I don't have to worry about it anymore. Is that not the case?
I would say one person who's pretty smart in the Biden admin said, this is the opioid view, that if I can just ignore it, it goes away. And in fairness, this has happened 3 times now. Every 4 years, there's a bubble. There's the beginnings of regulation. The bubble bursts and regulatory energy dies. This happened in 2014 when Mt. Gox exploded. All interest in regulation went away for several years. In 2017, when ICOs boomed and you saw the price of Bitcoin cross 20,000, was the first time I started to see in DC real interest in regulating crypto and giving guidance and regulation for it. When the price crashed in 2018, that went away. This is an amazing story. I love telling this. crypto was never discussed in the lead up to the Biden administration taking office. It wasn't seen as a major issue. It was surprising to everybody to have to work on it. When the Biden administration realized they needed to deal with it with the EO, almost no one in the White House wanted to work on this.
Right.
So now, right, we can do this again. We can have it go away where people think it's going away, do another 4 years, industry goes back bigger than ever, and even harder to wrap our heads around all the new areas of it. Or we can just respond to it as it is, which is what everyone wants. It's very interesting in that you have a chunk of the industry that is the most, I would say, libertarian, that doesn't want any legislation or regulation. You also have the most aggressive parts of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party saying the same thing. And they're both born, I think, out of a misunderstanding of some part of life, either the government or crypto.
Yeah. So this, I wanted to talk too about, Catherine, you mentioned, the Goldilocks zone. And Sarah, I think this is maybe more your area, but is there a proper Goldilocks zone? Because a big component would be like KYC, right? And you have the alternative will always be, not to the level of KYC that perhaps we need or would want to prevent like anti-money laundering uses, like here in the U.S. Like, is there ever a steady state where you think there can be enough onshoring to do legitimate business while still ensuring that those necessary protections are in place?
I think there is a path for that, and I actually think to give some credit to state regulators in the U.S., as utterly annoying as it is for every exchange, a lot of the state regulators have had to get smart about this. And I actually feel a little bit, I feel like we've rewound the clock to the 2014 Mt. Gox era, and at the time I was a younger lawyer and was in-house at Coinbase, and I remember going to all of these regulatory conferences and trying to get them to take me seriously. And all they wanted to do was talk about Mt. Gox. And it feels like, we're headed that way again right now. Like it's PTSD on some level. But as a kind of the good news is a lot of the state regulators did figure it out in the wake of Mt. Gox and when companies like Coinbase and Circle were first going out and getting licenses and when the BitLicense regs were being written. And actually, I had a pending application for a client in Texas, and I got an email today from Texas regulators saying, "Hey, we want to ask some follow-up questions in light of the last week's worth of events." And so they're really on it. They pay attention to the news, and they're active. And so I do think there is a sweet spot to find. The issue I have is I don't think that is to continue to work through this patchwork of state money transmission licensing. These regulations and these schemes were built on remittance laws. And so they're really good at regulating kind of the safety and soundness concerns as it relates to money transfer systems. But as everyone in this room knows, so much about crypto and crypto assets are not just purely monetary value. And so I actually, I think the state regulators are in a hard spot when it comes to questions like what assets should be listed on an exchange we regulate, because on one hand, they are the only regulators actively regulating the space right now. On the other hand, they're like, this is not what we're in the business of doing historically. And so that's where I think there's a huge opportunity. I think there's going to be a big hurdle to kind of get over the Mt. Gox 2.0 as it relates to regulatory discussions. But it can be done, and I actually do think the sort of safety and soundness model that exists for money transmission is exactly what we need at some kind of federal and more prudential level for the rest of the industry for other types of assets that are represented by blockchain-based tokens.
Yeah, and so that complexity is, I guess, why a lot of people argue that Gensler's approach is not really working because he's trying to ill-fit it into a more simplistic category, right? But what about? Let's talk about Gensler in the context of this, right? Because I've seen, the question I think posed. I forget exactly the article, but it was essentially, and I'll ask this to you: is the FTX crash, Gensler's fault, or did it prove he's right?
I mean, look, I think my argument, and I love Gary, I worked on Gary's nomination, let me say at the start. The idea that any one person is wholly responsible for this is probably fallacious. The way I describe it is this is the buildup of 10 years of benign neglect, not just by the current regulators as well, but the previous ones, right? What has not been noted enough is that the benign neglect of crypto began with Mary Jo White at the very latest, if not even before that, continued with Jay Clayton, and is continuing now. I mean, the biggest problem is the fact that, as one person who's very senior at the SEC put it to a coworker of mine, just so many people in the building, not just the chair, but the staff too, just want to wake up tomorrow and have this go away.
Yeah.
Because crypto challenges a lot of very tough questions. What happens if you create an asset and now it's not owned by anybody? How do you custody that? How do you S1 that? Nobody knows. What happens if we tokenize everything? What happens in terms of the information disparities? What happens to all the incumbents that have built their entire business model about being incumbents and rent seekers? It's really difficult. I mean, the line I actually say is that it's bigger than any one person. It's not just about Gary. It's not just about Chair Benham. It's not just about Janet Yellen. When something is this big and massive, that's when only Congress can actually solve it. I saw there was a Washington Post op-ed today that just basically said the regulators need to get together and start figuring out jurisdiction. I will say, a little blast from the past, in Dodd-Frank, which was the last time we did a big FinReg bill, there was a provision to require a memorandum of understanding between the CFTC and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission over unmasked electricity data and how to share it. It took 4 years to do a 30-page document. Jurisdictional fights between agencies are awful.
Yeah.
I've never seen anyone be good at them. The only way you ever get them resolved is either a decade-long court fight, or more commonly Congress says, here is where the baby is going to be split. We did this in swaps. Swaps, 90% went to the CFTC, then chaired by Gary Gensler. 10% went to the SEC. My personal view, not speaking for Paradigm, is that it's probably the case that you're going to have to take crypto and spread it across many different regulators, because this is so much bigger than any one industry.
Yeah.
It's part of the burden, but it's also part of getting to the right answer ultimately, because we do have multiple regulators and they do touch the space. And whether it's crypto or TradFi, where there's money, you're going to have people trying to come in and get it. Mm-hmm. And you're going to have the same types of themes that we had post-Dodd-Frank after another moment of punctuated equilibrium. And you're going to have to answer the same types of questions, whether it's custody, whether it's liquidity, whether it's proof of reserves. You have to answer those questions. And those are some of the areas where we don't have the questions answered. And Justin nailed it on the head there. It's because it's hard. You have to spend some time working on that. It is easier to go out and go after enforcement actions, like track down those facts. Those facts are out there, track them down, talk to people, figure it out. It is definitely harder and more involved to sit down and think, how does this technology work? And let's figure out regulations that work for it, the guardrails. How do we define some of these terms, which are the foundations of getting to the right regulation? And that's work that has started to begin, and we have a number of bills in Congress, but I do think there's going to be a need for some congressional action to sort out who's on first, who's on second, who's on third, from a regulatory standpoint, because there's just been too much territorial infighting. We're not getting the memorandums of understanding, and we can't wait 4 years.
That would be over a tiny thing. I mean, it's really amazing. I found the scary thing to people is to tell them how insanely complicated our current financial system is and how things don't work very well. My favorite example is this. Someone said, well, why can't these firms just get registered? I'm like, well, you can't voluntarily register. You apply to the SEC, and if they don't fit, you don't fit under a current box. If you don't raise any novel questions, you don't get registered. Well, what happens then? Well, either you don't work in the U.S. or you spend several years and several tens of millions of dollars getting the questions answered. I did this for a company as a consultant to be a very banal digital asset BD, and they took 2 years, several $1 million, got registered, have no volume because they still can't get their questions answered. I mean, the line I like to say is when one company can't figure out the rules, it is on the company. When two can't figure out the rules, it's on the company. When a whole industry and hundreds of companies can't figure out what to do, it probably is on the regulators. Right.
Yeah. It's disingenuous to say, come in and talk to me, but not have the rules of the road. We need those rules of the road. And this is, for me, I mean, we do speak to the regulators, and we're trying to get to that point and to help figure it out. But there are a lot of players out there that are good actors that need to have that definition. They're not trying to, the narrative that's out there from certain portions of members of Congress, the narrative that's out there of they just don't want to be they just don't want to do this. They want to skirt and they want to be fraudsters. That's just not accurate, right? It's too all-encompassing of the entire crypto ecosystem. It's just not the case.
Yeah.
And I think to the comments around educating regulators, like showing them, because a lot of times they also may not have in their personal lives access to the right tools and devices to kind of experiment on their own. And I think that's really critical, because the reason it's so hard, the reason it's, if it's one company, it's them too, but if it's everyone, is because these assets are hybrid assets that don't exist prior to blockchain, right? They have elements of monetary value. Many of them are used as part of investment schemes. Many of them have other types of commodity utility value. And because in one piece of technology, we have this kind of bundling of how we've previously drawn the lines for regulations, is exactly why it's hard to fit in any one bucket, but also why it's so important to educate the regulators so they understand that that's what they're dealing with when they're figuring out what buckets to put things in.
But something I'm hearing as you're talking about that is like, is there a need for something even higher level? Is there a need for organizational change in the regulator space? Are the old agencies no longer able to handle kind of the complexities of the modern technologies?
Can we get another 45 minutes?
Yeah, I know. We've
Long
got
screen on that. I mean, look, it's worth noting, right, that we are blessed and cursed in this country with a very alphabet soup of regulators. In Singapore, they have one. It's monetary policy and regulation for markets and central bank. That's the MAS. In the UK, they have three. They have the FCA, the Bank of England, and the Treasury. I did a count of this. We have 9. It's CFTC, OCC, SEC, FDIC, NCUA, Treasury, CFPB,
OFAC
Fed.
here.
I mean, it's incredible, right? And the
A
last
lot of mouths to feed.
But in fairness, having worked again at both CFC and SEC, it's been discussed for years that we need to merge CFC, SEC. I will say, having worked at both, there is an argument in our current system for having many, because it allows the prevention of a sense of one giant regulator that becomes a bureaucracy, and it allows more access points, therefore, for the industry, more ability for people as well to have additional routes to whistleblower complaints, less risk of being overtaken by one industry. It's more decentralized. But it does mean that when you have a new category show up, it breaks the whole system, which I will note, right? Part of the problem here is that even more than swaps, this really breaks the mold for how products work, which is part of why we've had so much trouble fitting it into our current regime.
And it's supposed to create having multiple regulators, you have niche specialties, but then where does crypto sit, right? So there's also talk of, should there be a regulator just for crypto? I think let's start with what we've got.
Right.
Don't
adding another 25 years.
Well, in long term, I'm not even sure that that's sensible, again, because it's such a hybrid technology, that arguably there are far more legal issues involved with intellectual property rights, as we've seen NFTs evolve in the last year or 18 months. And I don't think any money transmission regulator or securities or commodities regulator really probably has the right expertise to regulate NFTs or IP issues, at least as it relates to NFTs. And so I think I've heard should there be a crypto-specific regulator? And I think the reality is we need to just get better at figuring out which crypto, when we say crypto, maybe it's a terminology thing that we need to come up with subsets of crypto.
Right.
And based on what subset or subtype of asset it is, that's how you think about the regulatory landscape for it.
Yeah, I mean, we call this TC Sessions crypto. We're contributing to the monolith. It doesn't help necessarily, but we'll try to do better in the future.
If you come up with some nomenclature, let me know and I'll join. I use crypto too, so it's not something that I think we've figured out yet, even as an industry.
Yeah. So we have seen a wave. You mentioned some op-eds. We've seen a wave of that kind of follow this, right? Armstrong had a piece the other day where he was basically reiterating the enforcement action does not cut it as a means of regulation, right? And then Vinod had one today. Khosla, who was saying chaos keeps the incumbents protected, was I think the main takeaway there, which you also.
Yeah, there was the let crypto burn in Financial Times as well.
Right.
And then there was also the Washington Post saying regulators get together. I mean, it's so funny. A week ago, I would have thought we would have a big rush to have action. because everyone would realize there is now clearly a need for something. And you do see pockets of the Hill realizing something needs to be done. But I really didn't anticipate some of the people who are most anti-crypto to be the ones most opposed to new regulation. I think that's going to slow things down in a way that they have made a bet on what happens to crypto that maybe it pays off, but I think they may regret as well in a year or two.
Yeah.
But so my main takeaway there is just I see a lot of like interest, right? And there's a lot of demand, especially from the industry side. But the education is a good part about like how to make it functional, like once you get there. But the part that I don't see necessarily yet is the incentive part. Where do you see the big incentive, at least on the regulator side? Especially now, there's a lot of like, I need to save face, I need to step away from this. I had conversations with SBF, egg on my face, whatever.
I think a lot of it is the sense, first off, the fear it would go overseas. People are very nervous about China dominating this space before even the last week. There's increased fear of that. We heard, I think, from someone, actually from my other co-founder, Fred Erzim, 95% of trading volumes are abroad now. So that may increase, further. There's that. It's also just fear, I would say, that the bet that this would go away failed several times. Maybe it works this time, but sometimes past is precedent. I think there is an argument for a lot of people that if you just got it a little bit better, you're harm reducing, which is supposed to be one of the main goals of government.
Yeah.
You asked incentive. I think flip it a little bit. You are having consumers are getting hurt, investors are getting hurt because we don't have some of these guardrails in place. So, I mean, we're going to have a congressional hearing coming up to look at the FTX debacle. So you'll get pressure on the regulators from Congress through hearings, through public opinion, through consumers and investors that got hurt in this scenario and in others. And again, that's true whether it's TradFi or crypto. But so you will get that. So maybe incentive isn't the correct way to look at it for the regulators, but it's kind of that pressure to, hey, you can't just let it burn. You can't just ignore this. You have to pay attention. You have to put the work in.
Yeah, because there's felt harm. So that's the avoiding the felt harm part. And then there's not missing out on international opportunities is the positive. Do you have anything to add?
No, I agree with all of that, and I think I think this is, Catherine, what you were saying, but sort of my initial reaction is, well, I think on some level there is some incentive to save face. Like if there's egg on the face, there's some desire to clean it up if you want to continue to have a career in policy.
Right.
So I think on some level that is an incentive.
Great. All right. Well, that brings us to time, but thanks very much. It went by very quickly. And as Justin said, we probably could have talked for another 45 minutes, but we'll save that for another event. So thanks a lot.